The Joint Economic Committee will come to order. This morning, the Joint Economic Committee continues its hearings on the economy and economic policy for 1990 and fiscal year 1991. We're very pleased to welcome as our witness the Honorable Alan Greenspan, Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. Yesterday, President Bush submitted his proposed budget for fiscal year 1991. The projected deficit of $63.1 billion is based on the assumption that the economy will grow 2.6% between the fourth quarter of 1989 and the fourth quarter of 1990, that both short and long-term interest rates will decline by a percentage point or more between 1989 and 1990, that inflation will decline and corporate profits will rise by 19%. The weak fourth quarter growth of the economy and the recent rise in long-term interest rates both here and abroad cast some shadows on that forecast. Chairman Greenspan is here this morning to present his thoughts on the economic outlook and the appropriate monetary and fiscal policies for 1990. The committee will now turn to Chairman Greenspan for his testimony, unless either of my colleagues care to make a comment. Mr. Wiley?
Chairman, I have just a brief opening statement. I would like to welcome the chairman here this morning and look forward to his testimony. I can recall the sense of confidence expressed by financial markets when you were named head of the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and my perception is that that sense of confidence has grown steadily ever since, and we're glad to have you at the helm. The Fed is widely viewed as one of the most important parts of the U.S. government, and its policies are probably the most critical variables in economic policy. As such, it deserves substantial credit for the length of the U.S. expansion, in my judgment. I will be interested in hearing your views on the state of the economy and also the role that you see monetary policy playing, of course. I thankfully haven't seen the direct political response of voters to unfavorable pocketbook issues like recession. And I am, however, concerned that the very high real interest rates of the last year and a half and the wide fluctuations in money supply growth rates are causing very real problems. We extend a warm welcome, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to make this opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Miley. Mr. Chairman, you may begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased, as always, to appear before this distinguished committee. As you know, the Federal Reserve will be submitting its semi-annual Humphrey-Hawkins report to the Congress in just a few weeks. At that time, I'll be in a position to address more meaningfully the tactics and strategy of monetary policy. Under the circumstances, I thought it might be useful for me to focus my initial remarks this morning on the current state of the economy. Concerns that our long-term economic expansion may be nearing an end may have been intensified last week by the release of initial estimates showing that real gross national product rose by only 0.5% at an annual rate in the fourth quarter of 1989. To be sure, activity in that period was affected by a number of special transitory influences: the California earthquake, Hurricane Hugo, extraordinarily cold weather, and the long strike at Boeing. But even allowing for those factors, business activity in recent months clearly has been less vigorous than it was earlier. The locus of the recent softness is in what we can broadly characterize as durable goods. Most notably, weakness has emerged in the auto industry, and this has spread to related supplier industries, including metals, textiles, and machine tools. In addition, a number of categories of capital goods and consumer hard goods, as well as construction of both residential and non-residential buildings, have softened in recent months. In evaluating trends in such long-lived physical assets, one must remember that household and business users' ownership of them does not appear anywhere in the gross national income and product accounts. Nevertheless, by providing flows of services, these balance sheet items are an important determinant of the level of production. A fundamental characteristic of such durable items is that demand for them is shaped in part by the size of outstanding stocks relative to current household and producer needs. Viewed in this light, the current economic slowdown represents, at least to an extent, a pause in the accumulation of physical assets, a form of inventory correction, so that levels of ownership do not get too far ahead of the long-term desired levels. Because of their importance in understanding the current economic situation, it is worth examining some of these stock adjustment relationships in detail. Let me start with motor vehicles, where manufacturers have made sizable production cutbacks recently. It appears that auto assemblies in January may fall short of a 4.5 million annual rate, well below the 7 million unit rate over 1989 as a whole. The proximate cause of the recent production cutback was soft demand and rising dealer inventories last fall. The soft demand reflects a payback from the elevated sales pace of the third quarter, during which the use of price incentives was especially heavy on the 1989 model year cars. Moreover, demand for 1990 model year cars has been restrained by increases in sticker prices, which in many cases exceeded 5%. However, with the introduction of new incentive programs, sales picked up in late December and early January. This has reduced dealer inventories to more acceptable levels, and automakers reportedly plan to step up production somewhat in the coming weeks. Looking beneath these short-run variations in sales, production, and dealer inventories, however, current and prospective developments in the auto market reflect in part longer-range demand factors. Among the underlying forces are the existing number of motor vehicles owned per household and the average age of the auto and truck stocks. In order to see the role of these factors more clearly, it is useful to go back to the beginning of the last decade. Between 1979 and 1983, the number of vehicles per household, which had been on a strong upward trend throughout the post-war period, fell nearly 3%. A decline of 3% may not sound very large until you consider that it represents a shortfall on the order of 10 million cars and trucks between the actual stock of motor vehicles and the underlying trend stock. This decline in the per-household ownership of motor vehicles was likely a result of consumer reaction to the relative increase in gasoline prices and the downturn in economic activity that occurred during that period. Also, during the late 1970s and early 1980s, consumers slowed the pace at which they scrapped their existing cars and light trucks. The combination of lower scrappage and the lower sales of new vehicles pushed the average age of both the auto and truck stocks up approximately 1 year to over 7 years. The combination of an enormous pent-up demand, reflecting the gap between actual and presumptive desires of ownership, as well as increased replacement needs associated with an aging auto stock, provided the stimulus for the extraordinarily strong pace of auto sales posted from 1983 through much of the remainder of the decade. The number of vehicles per household has risen substantially, rising well above the earlier peak, and as scrappage rates have returned to prior levels, the average ages of the auto and truck stocks have leveled out. This rebuilding of the motor vehicle stock and stabilization in its average age suggests that the number of autos sitting in America's driveways is adequate to meet much of the desired demand for transportation equipment, and lowered sales at this point likely to reflect primarily replacement needs and growth in the driving age population. In contrast to motor vehicles, the current slowdown in construction of new homes and commercial buildings seems to reflect the situation where earlier activity was so robust that the actual stocks of residential and non-residential structures exceed desired levels, at least in some locales. Moreover, in the housing market, longer-run demographic factors also are having an effect on the underlying stock demand, especially the rate of household formation. This rate has been slowing and will slow further as more and more of the low birth rate cohort of the 1960s and 1970s matures into adulthood. What this means, of course, is that we need to lower our sights about what constitutes normal levels of home building activity during the 1990s compared with the 1980s. How the broad decade averages of demand get distributed from year to year depends in large part on financial conditions. Interest rates on home mortgages have been around 10% since mid-1989, and so from the home buyer's perspective, financial considerations have not varied to a great extent. In recent months, however, segments of the construction industry have reported difficulty in obtaining credit in the wake of newly imposed restrictions on lending by thrift institutions. Some added caution in acquisition, development, and construction lending was called for, given the riskiness of this activity. But the difficulties now being experienced by builders should diminish considerably over time as these businesses secure other financing sources for their creditworthy projects. Despite the reduced pace of housing construction, there continues to be an overhang of new single-family homes and condominiums for sale in a few regions of the country, and rental vacancy rates in the multifamily market remain high. But it is important to note that much of the market overhang is concentrated in the Northeast and shows few signs of leading to a national real estate market contraction. The reason is that the spread of local problems generally is limited by the geographical segmentation of real estate markets. Because neither residential property nor occupants are perfectly mobile, the market will not necessarily arbitrage away price differences observed in different local markets. Hence, softness in housing prices in some areas is unlikely to prove highly contagious in the short run. Indeed, in most areas, and on average nationally, real estate values have continued to increase. In the case of non-residential structures, there also is an indication of stock overhang, with vacancy rates for office space in metropolitan areas at near record levels. Moreover, lending institutions, stung by a long series of questionable investments, are more carefully scrutinizing loan applications than in the past, so that highly risky projects are not getting funded as readily. Reflecting these developments, building permits have turned down and new construction spending has been stagnant over the past year in all major sectors except industrial building. Business demands for new equipment also reflect, to a large degree, stock adjustment motives. Recently available data for the fourth quarter show that a sizable deceleration in business equipment spending is underway, reflecting the general slowdown in economic activity and expected sales. Real spending on produces durable equipment fell more than 4% at an annual rate in the fourth quarter. Part of the decline resulted from the work stoppage at Boeing, but even allowing for that special factor, real equipment outlays still declined somewhat. Looking forward, recent data are offering mixed signals about future capital spending. For example, orders for non-defense capital goods received in November and December show a bounce back from the decline that had occurred in the third quarter. Other indicators of capital spending, however, give the impression of softness ahead. For example, recent declines in real cash flow of non-financial corporations do not bode well for investment spending in the near term. In the 1980s, growth in cash flow, measured as the sum of undistributed after-tax profits and depreciation allowances, tended to move with growth in real gross business fixed investment. Thus, the recent cash flow experience, which has signaled a deterioration in the availability of internal funds, is one factor likely to be a restraining influence on capital spending in 1990. Moreover, this signal is being reinforced by surveys of plant and equipment expenditures taken this past fall that indicate real capital spending will grow less this year than last, the deceleration being most noticeable among non-durable manufacturing and non-manufacturing firms. Until now, I have been sketching the negative side of the economic landscape. Let me now suggest where we can look for more favorable signs. First, demand for long-lived assets is still growing in some areas, creating opportunities for strong production growth. This is most clearly evident in the case of civilian aircraft, for which the level of orders backlog has doubled over the past 2 years. Second, in contrast to some past cycles, we have not seen the type of speculative buildups of materials and finished goods by businesses that can exacerbate the effects of any weakening in sales trends. I believe one reason for this is that thus far we have avoided a cyclical upswing in inflation, so that the buy-in advance motive has been less of an influence. Third, foreign demand for many of our manufactured products is strong. Real export growth of manufactured goods, although down somewhat from the torrid pace of 1988, remains sizable. Strength runs across a wide variety of consumer and capital goods, as well as industrial supplies. Fourth, there is evidence from labor markets that the spillover effects from durable manufacturing have been limited. Although manufacturing employment has fallen nearly 195,000 jobs since last March, total private non-farm payrolls have continued to rise, with the increase totaling about 1.5 million over that period. The contribution from the health services area to the overall increase has been especially noteworthy. Employment in medical care, which made up about 7% of total payroll employment last year, has increased nearly 400,000 since then. Other sizable employment contributions have come from business services and state and local governments. Favorable signs about the economy's economic health are also revealed by comparing recent movements in an index of leading economic indicators with its pattern of movements just before and during previous recessions. Recently, statistical procedures have been developed that allow such a comparison to be translated into the likelihood of a recession. These procedures have been applied by the board staff to the Commerce Department's Index of Leading Economic Indicators, which comprise several real and financial market variables. The resulting measure suggests that the probability of a recession developing in the next 6 months increased last spring to almost 30%, but according to the most recent estimates, has declined to about 20%. A second probability of recession measures is based on a leading index recently compiled by economists with the National Bureau of Economic Research, which relies less heavily on data from the manufacturing sector than does the Commerce Department index, and does not include stock prices. The probability of a recession in the next 6 months, based on the NBER index, also has declined since last spring, and according to the December reading, stands at about 10%. Both probabilities are much smaller than those occurring at the beginning of each of the 4 recessions since the late 1960s. For example, the probability exceeded 50% shortly before each of the previous recessions using the NBER index. However, I wouldn't want to bet the ranch on such statistical measures. I think we must continue to monitor developments closely and stay alert to the possibility that perhaps reinforced by some adverse shock not now visible, the weakness in the several sectors I've discussed might accumulate and lead to a more widespread downturn in activity. But such imbalances and dislocations as we see in the economy today probably do not suggest anything more than a temporary hesitation in the continuing expansion of the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We'll proceed in the committee under the 10-minute rule. Let me direct your question first to the area that you concluded your statement with, and that's the possibility of a recession. We had several distinguished economists here last week to testify about the outlook on the economy, and one of them at least estimated the chance of a recession at 35%. I noted the figures used in your statement under the statistical studies, which you said you would not bet the ranch on.
Or most anything else.
All right. How do you describe for us the risk of a recession in this year?
First, let me say that the probability numbers that are being used are very weak. By that I mean they are very general orders of magnitude, and say the difference between 10 and 25 or even 30%, in my judgment, is not significant. I do think what the measures suggest is that the probability is less than 50%. And I think that if one looks back at the period, say, from the early spring through the summer of 1989, it's clear at that point that the probability of recession, whatever it was rising. And that as we moved into the fall, you began to get the types of conditions which usually signaled the cumulative downturn that we so typically have seen in our economy. We have not seen that process accelerating. We are observing an economy which is continuing to soften, but not in a way which is cumulatively progressive. And to the extent that that process can be stretched out, we will effectively eliminate the types of inflationary imbalances which existed, say, in a good part of 1988 and the early months of 1989, and hence can resume a balanced economic growth.
Are you less or more optimistic about avoiding a recession in January of 1990 than you were a few months ago?
I would say that the probability of recession now is less. I do not think it is negligible, nor do I think that one can just readily dismiss those probabilities as irrelevant. I think we are still at risk. And as a consequence, I think we must continue to monitor, as indeed we do at the Federal Reserve, on a day-by-day basis, all of the various elements in the economic process which could lead to a recession.
Excuse me for interrupting you. Let me turn to the other problem, and that's inflation. In 1989, we had a 4.6% rate of inflation. What is your comment with respect to that performance and its impact on the economy, and how you see inflation in 1990?
An inflation rate, as I've said many times in the recent past, Mr. Chairman, at 4.5% is unacceptable. It's unacceptable because it is very difficult in that type of environment to prevent it from accelerating. And should the inflation rate begin to accelerate in any measurable form from where we are today, still at the 4.5%, then I think we create the types of imbalances which indeed then do create the type of recession which we've had in the past. So in a sense, inflation at this stage represents the greatest threat of recession that we have, because it will bring with it the types of imbalances which turn us down. At the moment, I would say that the underlying cost structure is not accelerating, but it also is not decelerating either.
Is there a gradual acceleration in wages, and is that having an impact on the inflation rate?
I don't think so. I think the latest data that we saw, the so-called employment cost index, which is the broadest measure that we have of the wage structure, actually showed a mild decrease in the rate of wages and salaries, but it's for statistical purposes seasonally adjusted. For all practical purposes, it has been flat. What concerns me is that we have, in this context of a relatively stable rate of inflation, experiencing a decline in profit margins, which is another way of saying that there's been a gradual increase in underlying unit costs. Now, I wouldn't describe them as in any way an issue of concern. The data for looking at costs, prices generally, are reasonably stable, but they are all at a rate of increase which I and my colleagues find unacceptably high.
We've had a rise in the long-term interest rates since December, and in testimony before this committee in recent weeks, we've had really two explanations for it. One is that it's a reaction to the Fed's loosening of money policy, the decline in the federal funds rate, which investors fear will increase inflation. That's one explanation. The other explanation is based on the international markets. They see the rise in long-term interest rates, especially in Japan, as having an impact, and that's made the United States relatively less attractive to Japanese and other investors. Do you find either of these explanations compelling?
It's very difficult to know precisely why in world markets the participants do what they do. I think we can say that this perception in the American economy of a declining probability of recession has probably increased the number of those who had been expecting a significant decline and had accumulated holdings in long-term U.S. Treasury bonds as a speculative investment for that type of prospect, and have pulled back as the probabilities of that occurring has fallen. There's also probably, as a consequence of at least some expectation that we may be coming out of this very soft period, there may be some modest increase in inflationary expectations, which is embodying itself in long-term U.S. Treasury rates. I think similar issues are arising in Europe and in Japan, and that has clearly moved rates higher, especially in Japan, and obviously, since we are dealing in an international market, there is considerable arbitrage which is going on between the various different markets. But if one looks at the exchange rate structure, it's clear that the expected inflation rates or changes in inflation are not changing significantly, that there is a general, probably at this stage, moderate increase in inflation expectations worldwide. It's very difficult to measure exactly what various motives are or what the size of it is, but I think that's probably the most general explanation.
You don't have a concern at this point in time that foreign investors, particularly the Japanese who are buying up a large number of our securities, will stop coming into our markets?
Well, I should certainly think that if we make our markets unattractive, that they will do so. If you will do that either by having an inflationary environment, which clearly will make the long-term purchasing power of Treasury instruments less, could essentially divert them.
Is that happening now?
It's difficult to say. I think that the concerns of Japanese investors are probably not distinguishable from the concerns of American investors. But I do think that there is probably some element of shift by Japanese investors as far as their general attitudes are concerned to their domestic issues as their long-term rates have risen rather sharply relative to ours. But I would not overly stress that point. There's more to this process, I think, than simply a modest shift of that dimension.
Mr. Wiley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Those last answers caused me to move into another area. I was with the Reserve City bankers yesterday, and they're concerned about foreign investors and what they will do, and whether the foreigners who have money invested in the United States economy will act differently from U.S. investors. Now, you answered it in part, but are their views different when they look at the investments in the United States than ours? Would a Japanese investor or a West German investor look at it differently?
I mean, look at our investments differently from their own domestic ones?
Yes.
I don't think so. I think that they basically look for the highest long-term real rate of return, and so long as our markets are open, so long as the ability for them to invest long-term and then withdraw their funds, which of course is the basis of our laws, they should make no distinction between domestic investment and investment in the United States, and I surely hope we do not put impediments in the way of that free flow of capital, because as I testified recently before the Ways and Means Committee, there is a accelerating globalization of finance that is going on, that not only is trade becoming increasingly more rapid than domestic production, and therefore goods are flowing across national boundaries at an accelerating pace, but it is also true of necessity, of finance. And if we endeavor to block that type of flow, I think that we undercut the growth in living standards in the United States, and I think it surely does not serve our purposes.
I think that was their concern as to whether our markets would remain open, and I think you've used the key word there rather than whether we get into protectionist activity or protectionist measures. But you and the Treasury Department are actively intervening in foreign exchange markets. According to your December report on foreign exchange operations, you spent $5.9 billion to buy yen and German marks last fall. What is the objective of such active intervention in the markets?
The basic purpose is to try to stabilize undue fluctuations in the exchange rates. Because of the increased globalization, it's becoming increasingly evident that stability of exchange rates is an important goal for the major trading countries of the world. And while keeping domestic inflation under control is by far the most important way that we all can keep exchange rate stable. Nonetheless, we do embark upon other marginal techniques which we believe will smooth out some of the fluctuations and enhance stability. And the actions by the Treasury and the Federal Reserve in that regard were directed towards that purpose.
Is that intended to stabilize interest rates? And the reason I ask that question is how does the recent rise in foreign interest rates affect our own monetary policy? And is that a part of the reason for the intervention?
No, the intervention was solely related to our perception that there were elements within the market in which intervention could move against effectively.
I think as you ended your statement here, and I wasn't right clear at the beginning, but you said you wouldn't bet the ranch on statistical measures and as to where we're coming out. But I believe I detected a note of optimism as to how you feel about economic activity and strength in the months ahead.
Well, I don't like to appear either pessimistic or optimistic, but it is certainly the case that if one were to sketch the typical pattern of American business cycle expansion and contraction, the time frame for when the significant acceleration recession should have begun was several months back, a number of months back. However, we don't have a fixed pattern. It varies, and anyone who has been in the forecasting business as long as I have and been chastened more times than I would like to mention, Mr. Wiley, doesn't take that fact in and of itself for more than a modest element of optimism.
Well, you noted that consumer confidence was down in recent months, and I wonder if that in part is due to the fact that economic activity in the last 3 months of 1989 was somewhat depressed, and I think it was partly because, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because of strikes at Boeing and the telephone companies, Hurricane Hugo on the East Coast, and the earthquake in California, and the severe winter during the months of December. Is your optimism in part based on the fact that January has been very mild so far, and that there does seem to be a more favorable atmosphere vis-a-vis catastrophic happenings?
No, not actually, Mr. Wiley. I think that, in fact, while it is certainly true that the January has been somewhat milder, it's more an issue of the fact that automobile sales, after being down so poorly and looking as though they had been really going to hold at exceptionally low levels, have at least come back a bit, and that's not a particularly bad sign considering their role in this most recent period. And I must say I was somewhat, I guess heartened is too strong a word, but looking at some of the underlying materials order patterns, they have held up somewhat better than one would have expected, and I think what that is suggestive of is the usual inventory backup that occurs in the durable goods materials areas has not been typical this time, at least not in the context of previous such periods.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Scheuer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back to us.
Thank you.
Mr. Greenspan, your testimony is always stimulating and thoughtful. Just glancing through your testimony, one gets the feeling, yes, recession may not be around the corner, but you get a sort of an Uchi feeling that all is not well, and that this isn't the typical American gutsy, muscular economy. Just putting together bits and pieces of your language. You talk about, you don't have numbers on your pages, but anyway, recent softness in the durable goods market. Soft demand and rising dealer inventories for cars. Demand for 1990 model years has been restrained by increase in sticker prices. Slowdown in construction of new homes and commercial buildings. Reduced pace of housing construction, now we're up to page 5. Sizable deceleration in business equipment spending. Capital spending gives the impression of softness ahead. Real capital spending will grow less this year than last. Manufacturing employment down nearly 195,000 jobs. You do speak on page 7 of real export growth of manufactured goods. Remain sizable. That's an encouraging note. But I can't help seeing an economy that's lax, that is not surging. It is not the typical economy that has provided increase in living standards, increase in wages, increase in gross national product. From the point of view of of decision makers in the Congress, we look at this sort of weak, lackadaisical performance of the economy, and I can't help wondering what should the Congress do that we aren't doing now to stimulate things. Is it that we need to be more competitive, raise education levels, raise savings levels so that more capital investment to increase our productivity? What do you see as the underlying causes for this sort of lackadaisical, weak-kneed, rather pusillanimous, faint-hearted level of energy in our economy? What should we be doing that we aren't doing? And what should we stop doing that we are doing to give this whole economy a shot in the arm?
Well, first of all, let's remember that economy has gone through an extraordinary expansion. I mean, we have had 7 years of really fairly reasonably strong growth with rising productivity and rising standards of living. What we are observing now is a process of adjustment, and if we manage to get through this period without a recession, which is the typical process that we in the United States have to rebalance the system, we would have done it by what we used to call rolling readjustments. That is, the fact that individual industries or individual areas would go through a recession but not accumulate into the total. But I think you're raising a much broader question about the future, and I think I would pick the particular point you raise with respect to savings. What's wrong with our economy, if one can say there's something fundamentally wrong, is that we do not save enough. And while there are other elements that cause productivity to rise and standards of living to rise, there's no question that savings and investment, specifically it's the investment obviously, but the savings which finances it, it is the investment that creates a substantial part of the growth in productivity and hence in living standards. Our domestic savings has been inadequate to really create capital investment to move us, and we are fortunate in that respect that foreigners are putting their savings in our economy in record amounts because they see this as a potentially expanding economy and an economy with potential real rates of return in it.
Well, excuse me for interrupting, but doesn't that give you some concern that we're borrowing 150 or 60 billion dollars a year more than we're earning.
It certainly does, Mr. Sherman.
Japanese and the West Germans are lending 150 or 60 billion dollars a year less than they're earning. I mean, this is sort of a narcotic drug, isn't it?
I don't want to necessarily subscribe to your choice of words, but I do agree. Look, there's no question that to the extent that we have a current account deficit, which means that we are taking in foreign savings, it means that we are consuming more than we are producing in goods and services as a nation.
Now, Mr. Greenspan, we read that interest rates between what the Japanese pay their own savers and what we pay our savers now is the differential is 2% or less. Might that not mean that if we want to hold on to that flow of savings into our country from Japan and other countries, we're going to have to increase interest rates since we don't seem to be able to generate enough domestic savings to fuel a muscular, burgeoning, expanding economy?
No, that doesn't necessarily follow, but I think what does follow without question is that we have to increase our domestic savings either by increasing private savings, which has not been adequate, but where government policy clearly is most appropriate in this respect is to bring down the federal government deficit, because the federal government deficit is negative domestic savings and a very substantial negative domestic savings. If we could bring down the federal budget deficit, in fact, hopefully eliminate it and go to a surplus, that means that the need that we would have for importing savings to finance our domestic investment will accordingly decline, and much of the problem that you see, and I think quite correctly, with respect to our over-consuming would be eliminated.
Let's talk about that budget deficit drive. And let's talk about this morning's papers. I don't want to drag you into a discussion on the peace dividend, although I would love to. But take, for example, the difference between Mr. McNamara's expectation and hope that our defense budget could go down on the order of magnitude of about 5% in real dollars over the next 10 years. So we'd have a 50% reduction in defense expenditures, and the administration, Mr. Cheney, who are sort of hovering around 2%, a little bit less. Obviously, there would be a tremendous peace dividend if we could get away from the big ticket items, the big hardware items that we still seem to be planning on continuing with, in the face of a Russian empire that seems to be unraveling before our eyes. And that threat seems to be the military threat. Major aggressive action by the Soviet Union seems to be disappearing into the morning mist. Can you tell us what the differential effects on our economy would be if we could achieve the McNamara 5% in real dollar reduction of the budget over 10 years as against this projected reduction of less than half?
Well, Mr. Troy, I certainly don't want to get into a debate on appropriate military structure. But I think it is important to recognize that the differences between Messrs. Cheney and McNamara probably is the forecast that they are making of the evolution of the events that we are all seeing occurring in front of us. And there are lots of different scenarios that can occur, and I think as a consequence of that, different paths for defense budget. But clearly, we all would be hopeful that the need for defense budget falls very dramatically, because to the extent that worldwide the proportion of GNP that goes for world armaments around the world in all countries, that is a net reduction from living standards. and that applies to us as well as to anybody else. So I don't think it's a question of would it be desirable if we could do it. The basic, real fundamental question is this extraordinarily crucial judgment about what is the state of risk in the world and how it will materialize in the next number of years.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Snow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Greenspan, for being here this morning. Would this quarter's figures, when they're released in April, determine whether or not we've turned the corner on a recession?
I don't think so. I think we probably will need data into the spring to be reasonably secure in that respect, because the process that we're going through is almost glacial, and that's probably good, not bad. And if it continues, I don't think we will get a clear fix until we're well into the spring months.
So it could be a better part of this year before we actually have an understanding of where this economy is going.
We never really know where
No.
it's going.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
That I know.
there's always
We certainly
20
don't here.
in retrospect, it was always self-evident, but it never is.
Well, coming from the Northeast, where we obviously have some serious economic problems, especially in New England at this point, with revenue shortfalls and probably unprecedented in many respects. And much of it is due to the real estate, as you mentioned in your testimony, but it also is due to other major purchases like automobiles. I mean, for example, in the state of Maine, 35% of our sales tax will come from, revenues will come from the sale of automobiles and housing. Well, how does that reflect on the national economy as a whole when you see the big three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler may have a drop in profits of, 60%? How does that reflect overall for the national economy if avoiding a recession really is dependent on a strong consumer spending?
Well, I think that avoiding recession is dependent more on consumer spending, but it is related to exports as consumer spending, and also the elimination of the negatives. Once you start to eliminate things that are going down and just make them neutral, that is a net plus to the system. Remember that at the moment, the level of economic activity is high. The unemployment rate is really quite modest, and in certain analysts' minds, below normal. So, we are not at this stage in an economy which can be described as weak. So that the other side of that coin is that you cannot, therefore, be expecting rebounds in the economy as a whole. That is the typical rebound we see coming out of a recession. It is certainly the case that what we're going through is very slow, and that the pickup that will occur at some point is going to have a characteristic seeming that the economy really is improving significantly. But we're not looking at 4, 5, 6% annual growth rates, which is the type of numbers we often would see coming out of a recession.
Do you look at regional economies? For example, with the number of states, I guess in the recent Wall Street Journal article, it indicated there may be as many as 34 states that are facing problems with their revenues. Do you look at the regions in determining your monetary policy, or do you think it's just unique to that particular region?
No, unfortunately, our monetary policy can only be national, because we are dealing with a national interest rate, a national currency, basically national prices. Nonetheless, in crafting what policies we do, we are exceptionally aware of local conditions, because you can really only understand the economy as a whole as a sum of a bunch of parts. And the very nature of the Federal Reserve and the fact that we have these regional banks which each have their own research departments, we absorb as a system an extraordinary amount of regional information, which I think is exceptionally useful, in fact indispensable, to the policy actions that the Federal Open Market Committee is required to take.
Would you say that New England's in a recession?
I don't want to characterize any individual area as being in recession or not in recession, but clearly New England is in a much weaker state than it was, and it's come down from a very strong, in fact, almost hyper state of economic activity to something which is very significantly less.
Well, I've just noticed in my own state, for example, that people are retrenching in terms of their spending. I mean, they just lack the confidence. Even though they have a job, the unemployment rate hasn't increased significantly to indicate that there's something seriously wrong in that area. But people are nevertheless hesitant about spending because of the decline in the value of real estate and whatever else has happened, that they're not just spending. And I just wonder if that's a precursor, you know, on a nationwide basis.
I wouldn't say so. In fact, if you're looking at the full detail of what's going on in this country at all times, you can, even in the periods of extraordinary economic buoyancy, find a significant number of pockets which are doing poorly, either industries or regions. There will always be, in a market economy as diverse as ours, fairly substantial numbers of pockets which are doing far less well than the average or the country as a whole.
What impact do you think capital gains tax would have on our economy at this point? Would it serve as an appropriate stimulus?
Well, I've always been in favor of a much lower capital gains tax rate because I think that it is at the margin of capital investment. And my only concern, as I've stated before committees of the Congress over the past couple of years, is that I reluctantly, to the extent that I was involved in any discussions with colleagues, acquiesced in eliminating the capital gains differential as part of the significant decline in marginal tax rates in the 1986 tax reform. And while I would have preferred lower capital gains tax rate, I thought that the bringing down that marginal rate was very important to the economy, and I still believe that is the case. If the cost of getting a reduction in the capital gains tax rate is to raise that margin, I would be dubious as to the merit. But if you're asking me, would it be helpful to the economy if only the capital gains tax rate was reduced, the answer is unequivocally yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Obey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenspan, you have a very tough job. Sometimes you have to exercise the use of the tools available to you within a very narrow range, given other conflicting pressures in both the world economy and our own. You get a lot of advice in doing that. You get advice from members of Congress. You get advice from some members of the cabinet recently, and indeed even the press secretary for the White House has given some advice. And I'm wondering whether you'd like to return the favor. You do have, depending upon what our fiscal policy is and depending upon what other actions are occurring in the economy worldwide, you do sometimes have an extraordinarily limited road that you can walk. As you know, the administration this year estimates growth at about 2.6% in the new budget. CBO estimates about 1.7. As I understand it, the difference in the estimates between CBO and OMB over a 2-year period result in a difference of about $19 billion on the revenue side for fiscal 1991. What assumptions do you think would be the most prudent for the Congress and the President to agree upon if we were to be following a fiscal policy that would give you as much room as possible to maneuver over the next year or two in helping to manage an economy in a very delicate situation?
Well, Mr. Obey, I think there's no question that the lower the federal budget deficit, the better it is for the American economy overall, essentially for the reasons which I discussed with Mr. Scheuer, namely the question of savings and investment. The problem that you have when you go through this annual evaluation is that implicit in the President's budget is an economic forecast which of necessity requires that the President and his advisors assume that what is requested is accepted by the Congress. And I think, as Dr. Boskin mentioned yesterday in discussing the economic proposals of the administration, implicit in their forecast is the agreement on the part of the Congress of all of the proposals that are in the President's budget. The CBO evaluation, on the other hand, essentially makes a projection for current services and does not embody a policy implementation in its forecast. And I think one can very readily agree, or should, that if the budget deficit is brought down appreciably in line with what is in the President's budget, then the forecasts that they are making are not by any means unreasonable. I mean, they're not that far from a current services estimate now, but I wouldn't consider that they were particularly inappropriate for the conditional outlook which presupposes full passage of all proposals in the budget.
So in fashioning, if in Congress's fashioning of the budget for the coming year, you would be comfortable if we assume a revenue level for 91, which is $19 billion above CBO's estimate.
Well, I don't. First of all, I think that it's important for the Congress to evaluate in detail all of the various elements, as I'm certain you will. I don't want to stick to a specific number because I'm not sure that I would agree with all of the elements, even with the presumption of the budget change implicit. But what I do think is crucially important is that if we are to meet the Graham-Rudman targets, then I think it is appropriate to make a presumption with respect to the outlook, which does endeavor to encompass that issue in it. Because if you do not, the irony of it is that you probably will achieve more of a deficit cut than the requirement to go to the $64 billion fiscal 91.
Well, my concern is this. If we assume the administration's revenue number and therefore assume that it will be necessary to make fewer reductions on the spending side than would be required if we assumed a lower revenue number, then in fact at the end of the year we would wind up with a deficit higher than that would in fact meet Graham-Rudman's target.
Maybe. I mean, if you're asking me would I prefer more rather than less, the answer is yes.
I mean, if I were to ask you, we've been talking percentages in terms of recession, in 10%, 30%, 20% used by different people. If we adopted the growth assumptions of the administration, and therefore the revenue assumption, what percentage chance do you think we would have of actually hitting the required deficit reduction target for the following year after the year had?
You mean fiscal 91?
Yeah.
I mean, well, first of all, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree that you accept their growth assumptions. You therefore accept their revenue assumptions, because remember, when you go from growth, you still have to make judgments about the level of corporate profits, the level of personal incomes that are coming out of that. And even though the Tax Reform Act of 1986 has brought the marginal tax rates between a distribution of the national income between business and individuals, there are a lot of other elements involved in the estimate of corporate profits which don't directly get involved with the real GNP growth rate, which can affect revenues. So that I don't want to, necessarily say that you lock that closely in, but in a general way, I would be inclined to say that outlays in line with the president's budget, I think you would come out perhaps not all that far from the Graham-Rudman targets.
Okay, I'll write it down and talk to you about it next year and see where we've come out. One other question. Does the chairman of this committee look like a bomb-throwing institutional radical to you?
He's saying that he is, but doesn't look it?
No, I'm asking how you feel about that. Here's what I'm getting at. As you know, that Mr. Hamilton has introduced an interesting bill.
It's come to our attention.
It requires the Federal Open Market Committee to meet with Council on Economic Advisors, Secretary of the Treasury, OMB, several times in addition to the more formally scheduled meeting, to try to establish better policy coordination and communication between the Fed and the administration. It would also require you to publish your budget in the federal budget. Why is that not a reasonable proposition? And why would that not lead to at least some degree of improved trust on the part of the American public in institutions about which they have sometimes little understanding and about which there's a great deal of mystification?
Let me address the two issues that you raised with respect to the chairman's bill. On the issue of coordination, there is very significant degree of coordination that goes on between the administration and the Federal Reserve. We meet with them, I would say, fairly often. I meet with the Secretary of the Treasury at least once, more often twice a week, to discuss all various sorts of issues, in which monetary policy is one of them. I discuss it at considerable length with the Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. And there is no lack of communication in the sense that the views, ideas, disagreements get fully discussed. The issue which we are concerned about, basically, is that the formalizing of specific meetings at specific times, most importantly, immediately before an FOMC meeting, could become a vehicle by which undue pressures could be exerted. I don't think, frankly, it is a very major issue, but if you ask me how I would come out on the issue one way or the other, I think that we're doing fine the way it is, and I think the communications problems, which the chairman rightfully thinks is important, are appropriately addressed. If they were not, then I would have to rethink my position and perhaps would come out much closer to his position on that. On the publication of what it is that we do, we, as you know, do have an annual publication in which we publish in considerable detail what the Federal Reserve Board spends, what we receive, what we do, and we do it for the individual banks as well. Because such a significant part of the revenue of the Federal Reserve banks and as the system as a whole is on services which we provide to the private sector and are required to price at competitive rates so as not to unduly undercut the private competition for many of the check clearing services, for example, which we are involved in. We keep a set of books which are different from the way books are kept in the government. Now, obviously, we can translate everything we do into fiscal year budgeting in precise terms as to the format which appears in the budget. That, however, would be quite expensive.
It doesn't require you to do that.
I'm sorry, what?
The bill doesn't exactly require you to do that, does it?
No, but I think the issue is essentially the question of making projections. I think the major issue is the projections of our expenses. I think we can do it for a short period, but extended projections of what it is we do, we find very difficult to do accurately. And the main area of receipts, which is the receipts of the Treasury, namely our dividend payments to the Treasury, which is all of our monies other than or required for internal use, essentially depends on a forecast of interest rates. We don't make that forecast. The Treasury makes its projection of what Federal Reserve payments will be to the Treasury. And we had hoped that the fairly significant detail that we publish, which I think is greater than most agencies, fully fulfills the chairman's, I think, appropriate notion that we should be out in the open as much as possible on what it is we expend money on.
I remain unconvinced, but I thank you for your comments. I know my time is up, Mr. Chairman.
I think we probably want to get Chairman Greenspan to answer that question, whether or not I'm a bomb-throwing radical.
If you insist, Mr. Chairman, I will acknowledge that you show no signs of saying.
Thank you. Senator Sarbanes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Greenspan, I was interested in your response to Congressman Obey, where you said you meet fairly often with administrative representatives and that there's no lack of communication. And then you mentioned Secretary Brady and the CEA chairman and the OMB director. Does the White House press secretary appear in those meetings?
He does not.
Well, what's your response to an article I'm looking at of 10 days ago, merely 10 days ago, in which Marlin Fitzwater has, in effect, called on the Fed and said that lower interest rates are justified. First of all, I'm interested in this process, and then I'm also interested in the substance of this.
Yes, first of all, with the exception of, just trying to recall whether or not the meetings of this group, so-called Quadriad, with the President had Mr. Fitzwater there. I don't think so. But he is briefed on what it is that goes on in such meetings. I don't think I can appropriately respond to your question other than answer the fact to my knowledge he was not there, unless you want me to.
How often do you meet with the President?
Reasonably often. Not. I speak to him on the phone on occasion. I see him from time to time. I don't recall a case in which I requested an appointment in which I was turned down.
Now, what about the substance of Fitzwater's statement here, that lower interest rates are justified? Fed agree with that or disagree with it?
I would say we allow our record to speak for itself at this stage.
Are you then supportive of what Mr. Fitzwater has said?
I wouldn't interpret it in that manner.
What do you think of this method of communication?
I think it's inappropriate.
Inappropriate?
Yes, I do.
What do you think brought it about?
I cannot answer that. I don't frankly think it's an important issue. I don't, as I said I believe it was Banking Committee the other day, I did not consider that the President was in fact bashing us at that time. I did not think it then. I do not think it now.
Because you didn't think the President that Fitzwater was communicating the President's view, and therefore it was Fitzwater that was bashing you, or because you don't regard this as bashing?
In all honesty, I know Marlin Fitzwater fairly well, and he is not a basher by inclination. And I don't consider this particular choice of words the way I would phrase it. The President subsequently said that he preferred lower interest rates. Now, as I indicated to the House Banking Committee, I think we all would prefer lower real interest rates, meaning, in effect, interest rates adjusted for inflation expectations, which were as low as we could make them. Because clearly, to the extent that we succeed in that direction, economic growth will be at a maximum. I did not consider, for example, that the President's speech in Atlanta, which I think was a day or so later, stated anything which I found inappropriate.
Well, now this article says, and I continue to quote from it, the comments were a clear break with past administration policy. While White House officials have privately urged the Fed to ease, they have avoided public criticism of the central bank. Do you see it as such a break?
No, I think that there have been public comments here and there, which I don't frankly consider to be terribly important. I would say if you look at the overall relationship that the Federal Reserve has had with this administration, I would say it's been excellent.
I understand that, but do you regard this as a worsening of the relationship?
I do not, Senator.
Why is it inappropriate then for Fitzwater?
I think basically because any comments with respect to specific judgments as to where interest rates should go are best done in private. And I think that the choice of words that Marlin Fitzwater used probably was looser than I think they should have been. But I do not consider that that is an important issue, very honestly, and I must tell you I was not particularly concerned about it, nor do I, if I were to have run into Mr. Fitzwater shortly thereafter, I'm not even sure I would have mentioned it.
You've made no mention to him about it?
I have not. And frankly, don't think it's necessary.
Until today?
Until today. But, I mean, a lot of people in this town say things which I disagree with.
I want to reestablish this communication between you and Fitzroy. Let me ask you about Chairman Hamilton's bill about a provision that Congressman Obey did not touch on. There's a provision in that bill that would allow the president to set up the term of the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board in such a way that a president would appoint a chairman a year after taking office. I understand you oppose that provision, and I'm interested why, particularly since both Bill Martin and Paul Volcker in the past have supported that provision.
No, I think that's correct, and I think that it is a very marginal call. The problem really rests on the issue as to whether you want to create a problem which would mean that chairman would be appointed for a short period of time, which would occur if there was an automatic appointment a year after the president took office, or whether you want to lock in the 3 years, as chairman says, in which the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board is not subject to concern about reappointment by the president. My impression, basically, is that both McChesney Martin and Paul Volcker agreed with Lee Hamilton on that issue. Arthur Burns did not, and I must say I just sort of marginally come out where Arthur Burns did. But having said that, let me just say that, I mean, very honestly, if one has to come up yes or no on a specific issue, and I think the weight of evidence as I see it is no, but I will tell you that clearly it's not an issue which I think is frankly all that important. I think there are pluses and minuses on both sides of that question.
Is the Federal Reserve playing any role with respect to the Eastern European countries in giving them advice or counsel on establishing a modern banking system or a credit market?
We stand ready to do that, and as you know, Senator, I spent some time in the Soviet Union discussing such issues with them.
With the Soviet Union?
Soviet Union.
What about Eastern Europe?
I've been informed that we are working through the IMF on technical banking assistance to the Eastern European countries.
Which ones of the Eastern European countries?
Poland now. But
Poland.
we do stand ready to be of assistance, and will be should the issue surface as we suspect it will.
Now, there's often talk about a package deal for a tighter fiscal policy and a looser monetary policy. Is that even realistic to think about?
I don't think it's necessary, and I will say this for this reason, that if there is a significant budget compromise which significantly brings down the deficit, not only for fiscal 91, but in a manner in which the markets would perceive permanent shifts in the trends of spending and revenues, the first thing that would happen is that long-term interest rates would fall, I think, fairly quickly. And that would pull on short-term rates, and we in the Federal Reserve, when confronted with those market forces, would make appropriate adjustments in the federal funds rate to follow those markets. And essentially, it would be a market adjustment process. The implication of a deal is that the markets might not respond appropriately, and therefore the Federal Reserve should, in a sense, force the markets. But the only condition which I could conceive in which the markets would not respond is if they thought that the budget agreement was a phony, that in effect there really was more paper juggling and gimmickry than real deficit reduction. Obviously, were that the case, it would be inappropriate for markets to bring rates down, and it would be inappropriate for the Federal Reserve policy to respond to that. So I don't think it's not a real problem. We have been arguing and discussing this issue at great length for, I think, a number of years, and I'm as convinced as ever that if we make a major cut in the budget deficit, I think we would be surprised at how prompt the markets would react to that.
What's your view of the use of the surplus in the Social Security Trust Fund to mask the dimensions of the budget deficit?
Well, I think that Senator Moynihan raises the correct issue. Namely, it is fairly apparent, as a number of us have discussed numerous times in the past, that the purpose of building up the surplus was essentially to effectively get a mirror effect in the physical volume of investment and the production of goods and services, so that the resources would be available to meet the physical consuming requirements of the retirees, the so-called baby boom, as they come due in 2020 and thereafter. To the extent that the federal government builds up a surplus in the Social Security accounts which are not then used to finance other parts of the deficit, that means that the federal government is adding to domestic savings, adding presumably to domestic investment, and creating an increase in the productivity and real per capita output, which will eventually provide the wherewithal for those who are retiring in very large numbers in, say, 30 years or more. The problem that I have with the Moynihan proposal, unfortunately, is that merely cutting the Social Security tax and going to a pay-as-you-go basis doesn't answer how pay-as-you-go is going to function, because we are either going to have to very significantly increase taxes at the time when the benefits are forthcoming, and that raises some very serious policy questions about the stability of our economy and the size of the type of tax increase that would be required, or basically scale down benefits, or find other means of financing. And all I would suggest, Senator, is that before we move in that direction, we don't move in a single direction, but we think of the package which resolves all of these other issues, because if nothing else other than cutting the Social Security tax occurs, the situation which Senator Moynihan, I think, very correctly evaluates is made worse, not better.
Mr. Chairman, let me go back to Senator Sarbanes' questions with respect to Marlin Fitzwater's statement. It's inconceivable to me that Mr. Fitzwater would make that statement without the direct direction of the President of the United States. Would you agree with that?
Not necessarily.
You think a press secretary would get up and call upon the Fed to lower interest rates without the approval of his boss?
I'm not sure I would interpret the phrase exactly in that respect. You're asking me to certify events which I was not privy to, and I just don't think
Okay.
that's something I can do.
All right, that's fair enough. What about the fact you have informal contacts, you said. That's the way you coordinate your policy. During those informal contacts, had any of the President's economic spokesmen or the President ever said to you, we want interest rates lowered?
Yes.
So Mr. Fitzwater then was saying to you what you had previously understood to be the President's desire.
Well, I'm not saying that they're saying that now or at that time, but in the past, the answer is yes.
So his
That has
statement,
been true.
okay, that's I don't want to beat that horse anymore. I just wanted to make clear that the circumstances under which it occurred. Let me go to another topic.
Mr. Chairman, could I simply say that in this report it states, doesn't reach to the President, but it does say that the officials said Mr. Fitzwater's comments grew out of a discussion among senior White House staff. So it apparently was not simply a Marlin Fitzwater solo into this area, but represented a concerted judgment in the White House.
Let me say this in response to your question. You phrased it in terms of the President and his advisors, and I said yes. I should separate the President and his advisors. I'm answering to his advisors. The President and I have had different conversations that bordered on this, but we don't get into the detail that I would have with the advisors.
All right, let me go to another topic. If I understood your position with respect to the President's assumptions in the budget, you said that those assumptions, the economic assumptions in the budget, are all right, okay, if we get the deficit reduction that the President favors and projects. The problem with that, it seems to me, is that the President gets that reduction in his budget only because he uses very optimistic economic assumptions. Now, if our goal is really to get the deficit down, wouldn't it be prudent, better, if we did not have such optimistic economic assumptions, which tend to mislead us with respect to the difficulty of getting that deficit down?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think, you could look at it two different ways. I mean, you can say that the $64 billion should be a lower figure, or you can say that we should bring it down at least to 64. I would put it this way. There's no question that the deficit is basically sensitive to economic assumptions. And various different assumptions will give you various different outlooks. If there is any concern that the degree of budget deficit reduction will be inadequate, then there is nothing to prevent the Congress from setting a number in its reconciliation to less than $64 billion.
Well, there's a lot to prevent us from doing that.
Well, I'm saying, but there's a lot to prevent you, but if the economic assumptions are something you think, and I think quite appropriately, have margins of error, then I would suggest that one takes the margin of error into consideration when deciding what the budget is. And,
well, I don't blame the President any more than I blame the Congress. I think both of us adopt economic assumptions that mislead us and make it more difficult for us to get the deficit down. We fool ourselves. And it seems to me the prudent way to proceed is to adopt economic assumptions that are not on the optimistic side. Now, I understand that the President's economic assumptions are defensible. They're not off-the-wall types of assumptions. But to the extent that either the President or the Congress adopt optimistic economic assumptions on the high side, then you deceive yourself to some extent into thinking that the job of cutting spending is not going to be as difficult. And if you adopted, say, the blue chip forecasts or something that's more broadly accepted, then you'd see the magnitude of the problem of getting down to a balanced budget or something approaching that is greater.
Well,
that's the only point.
Yeah, well, Mr. Chairman, in fairness to the administration, however, I do think that if you gave to that group of blue chip economic forecasters a firm commitment to take as a given that the budget deficit would be brought down, that the programs would be put in place to very significantly lower the budget deficit, I think you would find that the average of their forecasts would come up much closer to where the administration is currently in its forecast.
I understand that. I have a couple more, and I know Mr. Wiley has a question. You're generally considered to be a consumer of economic statistics. You know, we've had in this committee an interest in the quality of government statistics, and I'd just like to get your general sense of, as a person who you and your colleagues use economic statistics, are we having a decline in the quality of economic data? And I might acknowledge here that the President is calling for an increase in his budget, which I commend him for, in statistical agencies.
Yeah, I would, relative to the changes that are occurring in the economy, the answer is yes. By that I mean we still have very good data in the manufacturing area. We have extraordinarily adequate data in vast parts of our economy. To be sure, there are certain types of surveys which we at the Federal Reserve, who publish the Industrial Production Index, are chagrined to learn may be eliminated. But overall, American statistics are really extraordinarily good. The problem, however, is that the nature of our economy is changing increasingly in a manner which the old statistical structure doesn't capture. In other words, for example, a very significant increase in the unit of production in this country is computer software. And to try to define a unit of computer software is exceptionally difficult. And in areas such as that, we need major improvement and major increase in resources. I am always hesitant, however, to talk about increased federal resources because I think that one really has to get to the point where major problems exist before I think it is relevant, especially in the context of our budget problems.
Are there gaps in statistical data that affect the ability of the Federal Reserve to analyze the performance of the economy?
Some, but I think we fill them in an ad hoc basis, probably reasonably adequately, but I do think it would be most helpful if we had, in certain areas, better quality data to make judgments. I mean, for example, there's been a huge increase in international transactions as the economy becomes more globalized, so to speak. And our data systems have not fully caught up to being able to fully evaluate all of the data that are coming in, especially on in the services area. And in that sense, we would think it would be most useful to have some improvements.
Mr. Chairman, I have noted in the press public statements by Fed governors with respect to their views on interest rates. And I was just checking with Mr. Buchner here. My own recollection, I didn't really recall Fed members speaking publicly about these matters. He tells me he thinks it may have been done in the past. You'll recall that in the middle of this month, two members of the Fed governors who reportedly had been proponents of easing have recently altered their positions, if I understand the press correctly, and now oppose further reductions in interest rates. I'd like you to comment on that practice and any other comment you care to make about that.
Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, there is a very fine line here that one has to be aware of. Federal Reserve governors and presidents of the Federal Reserve banks have, over the years, been making speeches about the economy, about a number of different issues, and I think that is most appropriate. I think that the education process is fostered by that. Another interesting occurrence, which I don't think people are aware of, is that the ability of the so-called business press to fine-tune statements of governors and FOMC members has improved dramatically. There's much greater technical understanding in the press to read between the lines of what individuals may be saying. And knowing full well what the two governors to whom you refer were saying at different times, in different contexts, it really is basically I think, heightened ability of the business press to read between the lines, which then creates stories which I think did not exist to the extent that they exist in today's environment, say, 20, 30 years ago.
What strikes me, Mr. Chairman, about this is not the fact that a Fed governor gives a speech on the economy, but that they speak rather pointedly and bluntly and directly to the issue, which is interest rates.
Well,
and
I would say that
indicating a change of position on their own part.
I would
that's
say,
what's really extraordinary.
Yeah, I would say that when that happens, and it happens rarely, it is usually a slip either on my part or on their part. We try to avoid that, and regrettably, on occasion, we fail.
Mr. Wiley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Greenspan, I think I understand where Senator Sarbanes and Congressman Hamilton are really coming from, and that's their perception that there is a communications problem between the administration and the Fed over monetary policy, and I think it's not really the interest rate issue that they're getting at, and I think it was I who raised the question, or a similar question, in the banking committee to which you responded. But all of us, I think, would like to see interest rates come down, and I don't think you have to be a genius to suggest that that might stimulate the economy right now or help the economy. But why are interest rates as high as they are?
At the moment?
At the moment.
I would say two reasons. Well, no, I think fundamentally one reason, namely that inflation expectations are high over the long run, higher than we would like them, lower than they have been earlier in this decade, but still too high. That has two effects. One, long-term inflation expectations embody themselves as inflation premiums in long-term interest rates. But there is also some evidence that the higher the inflation rate, the greater the instability in the economy, meaning the greater the uncertainty about the outlook, which means that so-called real interest rates also require an additional premium. So we are getting, in effect, an increase in both real and nominal interest rates because of increasing or because of a view of the longer term which is other than a stable, expected stable price level?
I thought it was good to have that answer for the record here. I thought someone else might ask this question about the funny actions of the bond market, using the word funny advisedly. The bond market has been very weak since the first of the year, and yields have risen substantially, as you know. Are you confident about the state of financial markets in the U.S.?
I mean, the confidence in what respect, Mr. Malley?
The state of the financial markets, given what's happening in the bond market.
I'm still not following. You mean confident about their stability, or?
Yes.
I would say that the markets have been fairly stable. I would put one caveat in there. As we have gone increasingly international, and we get far greater international flows in all of our countries, I think there is a sense of greater instability, which I think is false. I think it's merely the process of greater dynamics, more markets, more instruments. We have now so many different forms of markets: interest rate swaps, options on futures, futures on interest rates. I mean, and we have a very extraordinary interest in what's going on in Tokyo and London. So you get a sense of instability, which is really only evidence of the fact of this globalization, and is in no way reflective of underlying imbalances which can create problems.
That's where I was coming from. Are you concerned about Japan's financial markets and perhaps the impact that they might be having on the bond market?
I think the markets around the world have affected us for quite a long while. I think it's increasingly so as the globalization continues, and I think we will find that the interaction amongst all of the various different markets is going to increase.
All right. I think you've gotten about as specific as you can. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to meet in a few minutes with Douglas Hurd, who, as you know, is the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs in the United Kingdom, and one of the topics of discussion, I think, will be this common European currency. I'd just like to have your thoughts on how a common European currency and integrated credit market and all of the rest in Europe will impact on the United States economy.
I think it merely is, as far as we are concerned, not a major change, because remember, at the moment, what we confront as far as Europe is concerned is a European monetary system which has 2.25% bands across certain fixed rates, so that the difference between a common currency in Europe and what we have today is really not that major so far as we in the United States, with respect to trade and finance, are concerned. So I would only look at it as further integration of the financial system, and to the extent that we respond to it, my impression is that it will not create any significant discontinuity of which we are aware.
A couple other questions, and then we'll close up. We began our questions of you with respect to recession and the prospect of recession, and you made your views clear. In the event, however, the United States economy would slip into a recession, I'm interested to know what kinds of tools are available to the Federal Reserve under present circumstances to help the U.S. economy. It's generally acknowledged, of course, that fiscal policy is immobilized because of the deficit situation, but it's you also, I think, have to recognize that you have to be careful not to disturb foreign investors. And what kinds of tools are available to the Fed in the event of a recession in 1990?
Well, I don't want to get into detailed discussion on this subject, largely because how a recession ultimately occurs, and I think somewhere, I don't know, I say I don't believe it's this year, but I don't think the business cycle has been repealed. How the recession occurs and its nature will depend on the form of the response and what types of monetary instruments the Fed would bring to bear. You are quite correct, though, in the sense that not having fiscal policy as a variable to deal with does make it more difficult for the Federal Reserve, but we do believe we have adequate tools to make a difference, and hopefully
even in that
significant difference.
Then finally, you were discussing with Senator Sarbanes this Social Security tax problem. Those who propose to cut the Social Security tax argue that the surplus is being misused, goes into the general revenues of government, and in addition disguises, of course, the size of the deficit. Do you object to using the surplus, which came about, as I recall, because of the Commission recommendation which you headed? Do you object to using that surplus for general government spending? Did you anticipate that that would have to be done, and did you favor it?
We anticipated that it would be done in part because implicit in our overall view was that basically the budget would be moving towards, eventually towards surplus. And in that respect, it was the general view of all of us to a greater or lesser extent that prior to that point, in the period, say, between 1983 and when the presumption of the deficit disappearing occurred, that there would be that form of financing. And I think we all recognized it and decided that considering the various alternatives, it was the lesser of evils.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We're very pleased to have had you this morning, and the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you.